Welcome. We're thrilled you're joining Ashby Village and our fireside chat with Judith Heumann, moving forward together. We're honored that Judith will be teaching and inspiring us today. Many of you are very familiar with Ashby Village. Some may not be. We're a bold, caring network of people transforming how we age. We support each other with vibrancy, dignity, and purpose, wherever we call home. We have over 400 members, 300 volunteers of all ages, and a dedicated community of partners and supporters. If you haven't already, I invite you to join us as a member or a volunteer or both. Many are. We're happy to present these kinds and this quality of programming free of charge, so it's accessible to everyone. If you're able to support our ability to offer free programming, we invite you to donate to Ashby Village. We'll provide a link at the end of the webinar, and you can also look for a donation link in a follow-up email. Before I turn it over to Martin Paley, who's a longtime friend and ally of Judith's, who will introduce her, I want to acknowledge the prominent and long-standing role that Martin played throughout his career, including when he was executive director of the San Francisco Foundation and as a board member of the World Institute on Disability, directly supporting and publicizing Judys' activism, her advocacy, and her national legislative feat enacting disability rights. I also want to recognize, Martin, your 13-year tenure as an Ashby Village member and an influential volunteer. All right, Martin, take it away.
Thank you very much, Bev. This is a very special pleasure for me. I've known this woman and admired her for many years. You may know our guest via the amazing documentary depicting the camp where young people with disabilities gathered, in addition to how national policies were successfully challenged and changed. Or you may have seen her as an answer to a recent New York Times crossword puzzle. Or you may have read her deeply moving memoir, Being Human. And I recommend this book heartily, Being Human. Judy, Ed Roberts, and a group of young activists came together in Berkeley in the early 70s, established the Center for Independent Living, and launched a movement that has changed the world. Judy is a leader without peer. Judy epitomizes the definition of a visionary, one who defines the future she intends to create. She is my friend. Judy will be interviewed by Peter Sussman, author and retired editor at the San Francisco Chronicle, who became disabled late in life and currently serves on the board of the Center for Independent Living. His wife, Pat Sussman, is a co-founder of Ashby Village, and in these circles, he introduces himself as Mr. Pat Sussman. I'm now pleased to present Judy and Peter. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin.
Peter, could I say something?
Yes.
Yeah, so first of all, Martin, thank you so much. And thanks to the Ashby Village for inviting me to come and speak. And it's a real honor to do that. But I also want to say, Martin really, from my perspective, also is a visionary. He was the first, heading of the first foundation that gave money to the Berkeley CIL, $50,000, which was in those days a lot of money for many reasons. One was he was willing to take a risk. And I think when you look at his career, he very much looks at supporting new ventures, giving light to issues that others may not consider to be important. So for me, it's always been a real honor, Martin, to call you a friend because I've learned so much from you over the years. And I'm glad that you've learned some things from me. And that, I think, is one of the values of our friendship. It's learning from each other and moving forward. So thank you very much for those words. Over
Thanks.
to you, Peter.
Yep. Thank you. That's well worth saying. Martin's been a pillar. It's a pleasure to introduce Judy for this event. I'm a great admirer of her work, and I think there is no more fitting description of her than the one on her website. She's an internationally recognized badass disability activist. Judy maintained her badass rep through her years as an influential government official, and as Martin has noted, her stature has now been confirmed by a definitive measure. In a recent New York Times crossword puzzle, the clue for 35 across was leading disability rights activist in the 2020 documentary CripCamp. Of course, the answer to the Times expected its readers to know was Judith Heumann. Judy, in the mid-1970s, Ed Roberts asked you to move here from New York, where you had been a young activist in the new disabled rights movement. Among the reasons he wanted you here was to play a role at Berkeley's then new Center for Independent Living, which is now 50 years old and a major institution in the East Bay, as well as the model for other independent living centers around the globe. Please explain some of the background of your move here and the environment you found in Berkeley when you arrived here.
Thank you very much. So I moved to Berkeley in 1973 when I was basically doing two things. One, as you mentioned, Ed had called and said they were recruiting a few disabled people from around the country. He'd gotten my name from a number of different sources, and expectations were that we'd get involved with the Berkeley CIL, and I did. I went on the board as soon as I got out there, and that we would then go back to our communities and start other similar programs, which I didn't exactly do. For me, as an activist in New York, and I think it's important to obviously look at some of the major differences between Berkeley and New York. Berkeley's a very small community. I grew up in Brooklyn, 4 million people in Brooklyn alone. And so in New York, we were activists, we were working on legislation. We had started a group called Disabled in Action. We'd had numbers of demonstrations, which are seen in part in CripCamp. We were finding it a little difficult to kind of move to the next level. CIL for me was really a fantastic organization because it was new and it was really being created from the ground up. And by that, I mean, you had a group of young disabled people who really had experienced discrimination and were also graduates of UC Berkeley or activists in their own right. Not everyone went to Berkeley, but many of the people did. And we were really change agents. And I kind of defined for myself when I went out to Berkeley as being in a candy store where there were so many things that needed to be done. You could kind of pick your favorite candy and kind of move forward with it, which is really what happened. I had come to Berkeley in part because I had to get a master's degree. I sued the New York Board of Education to get my license. I taught for 3 years in New York City, and I needed to get a master's within 5 years. I'd been accepted into Columbia School of Social Work, Community Organizing, but what Berkeley was doing was different at that point because they had state laws like personal assistance services, IHSS, in-home supportive services, which I assume some of you may know about, unless they've changed the name since I've left. But being able to get in-home supportive services and to be able to work with a group of younger disabled people and to be accepted into the School of Public Health, where I was so lucky to have Henrik Blum as my professor. And some of you knew Henrik, and he was such an amazing man, and he really legitimized my way of thinking, because I never, neither then nor now, was able to kind of go down one road. I looked at the bigger picture, and I was and am interested in looking at how to make changes in many areas. And with that type of a thought, it can't be just something that I'm doing alone. It's got to be something where many people are working together. In some ways, I'm a generalist. And then you want to bring the specialists in to work more in depth on areas like Social Security or transportation or education or housing. So coming to Berkeley for me was a wonderful experience, because I was living in a small community where, even though there weren't curb cuts, you could safely drive down the streets, and it was a friendly community.
And tell us a little about the rolling quads.
So the rolling quads were something that was set up or informally developed in the 1960s. I got to Berkeley in 1973, and it was Ed Roberts and John Hessler and Larry Biscamp and a number of other people who were students at Berkeley. Many people may know that, Ed Roberts, who had polio and used a motorized wheelchair and used slept in an iron lung, was told that if he went to Berkeley, he would have to live in a dormitory. Hold on a second. I gotta go this way. And so this group of people began to call themselves the Rolling Quads. And they were also involved in setting up the Disabled Students Program at UC Berkeley. Obviously, Ed was really the leader in much of these activities. And he was the one, I think, that went to Washington and learned about, was able to secure funding to put some support into the university's Disabled Students Program, which was a very different Disabled Students Program from most parts of the country, because it wasn't just supporting students and helping them deal with getting their courses and books and things of that nature, but it was a precursor to CIL in as much as it had things like wheelchair repair. So if somebody's wheelchair broke, typically you were having to wait days or weeks to get your chair repaired. And the Disabled Students Program had wheelchair repair, and they also were doing personal assistance services, putting lists together so people could interview and hire their own people. And readers were also screened, so blind people could hire readers. But it was a very innovative program that eventually morphed into the Berkeley CIL.
And it was centered originally in the Cowell Hospital, where there was a wing.
Not the Disabled Students Program, but Ed.
Right.
Ed was in Cowell Hospital.
And others as well, because the university didn't have dorms that could accommodate them, right?
They weren't, yeah.
Okay. And by the way, Ed's mother, Zona, is still wonderful and a great presence in Berkeley at the age of, I think, 102 or something. Yeah. Okay. And I'm going to get a little more give a little more background as a preface to the next question. You were involved in the Over 60 Clinic in its very early days after it was founded by a multiracial group of Gray Panther women. Over 60 subsequently evolved into an East Bay institution that many of our people in our audience know, the multi-clinic lifelong medical care, which, by the way, was an early and a very important supporter and fiscal sponsor of Ashby Village. You were on Over 60's board when I first met you. You say in your memoir, Being Human, that one of your contributions to the board, and I quote, was to introduce the idea that disability was a natural part of the aging process. Thus, the fact that people acquire disabilities as they age should be accommodated so people can remain active in the community. End of the quote. So that makes you as a pioneer in the independent living movement for the disabled, and your emphasis on disability and aging makes you a pioneer also in the independent aging movement that led years later to Ashby Village. They're really overlapping concepts. So I'd like you to elaborate on the association of aging and disability and its implications for this country.
It's a great question. So let me just give a little bit more history because it's relevant to this. I was born in 1947, had polio in 1949. At that time, there were no laws in place addressing issues like accessibility or even the basic right that disabled children could go to school. And my parents were immigrants, and when I had polio in 49, outside of the fact that a doctor recommended when I was 2 years old that they put me in an institution, which they obviously chose not to do, they were just going to go ahead and raise me like my brothers and get me PT and OT and other things like that. But when I was 5, my mother took me to school. So I was denied the right to go to school because the building wasn't accessible, even though my mother was going to pull me up and down the stairs. And I didn't finally get to go to school until I was in the middle of the 4th grade. And for the first couple of years, 3.5 years, the Board of Ed in New York sent a teacher to my house for 2.5 hours a week. Now, why is that relevant to this discussion? Because you could see very early on that there were very low expectations for what someone could do with a disability. And in my case, I had a physical disability. I had no other learning issues. And we weren't even asking for accommodations. But it was the very beginning of just, not seeing disabled people as a part of society. And I think the other very important issue was that it was really, I think, in the 40s and 50s, where parents started really pushing back, trying to get changes made in the system. And then, moving it forward into the 60s and 70s, there was a movement within the movement, where there was litigation going on to close down institutions. So there'd been many institutions that were being developed all across the United States. And those institutions were basically the result of lack of expectations, lack of appropriate community services, lack of home and community-based services, lack of accessibility, lack of education, on and on, inaccessible housing. So for those of you who've watched CripCamp, one of the values of that film is you really begin to see that younger disabled people are really beginning to organize and really beginning to talk about discrimination, because discrimination was something at that point that really it was used in issues in racism, And it was being used in the Grey Panther movement that was emerging. But in the area of disability, it was still pretty tepid. And so the word discrimination was beginning to become much more part of the language of advocates and certainly disability rights leaders. When I was living in Berkeley and in graduate school and on the board of CIL, I had to do a placement. I went to Washington. I worked in a senator's office as a legislative assistant for what turned out to be about a year and a half. And when I came back to Berkeley, I got involved, as you were saying, Peter, with the over 60s health clinic because of Dr. Blum. And that was a very eye-opening experience because in the disability community, we were fighting against segregated anything. We were fighting against housing for disabled people. We didn't want housing for disabled people. We wanted housing that was accessible. We wanted more home and community-based services. We wanted benefits, etc. So one day I was thinking about how the younger movement was really fighting against all this segregation that had been put in place. And I was really concerned that as people were getting older and acquiring disabilities, which is another whole issue about non-disabled people and disability and not feeling comfortable identifying as having a disability. And, you know, my mother, who was a very strong advocate, when she got cancer and couldn't walk outside, didn't want to be seen in a wheelchair, which completely blew me away. And then I spoke to many other friends who experienced the same thing. So we can get into discussing this whole issue of people's not wanting to be identified as having a disability. But at any rate, what was going on for me in the late 70s was looking at what was going on in the younger movement, where we were fighting against segregated housing, fighting against segregated transportation, fighting against segregated education, you know, raising expectations for employment. And yet we were seeing some of the same programs evolving based on age. So Lillian Rabinowitz was one of my very good friends, and she was one of the founders of Over 60s. And I really loved having discussions with her and other people, and Meredith Minkler, who I lectured in her classes while I was in Berkeley till I left. And I was, for a good number of years, involved with some other organizations as a speaker on aging and disability. And when the World Institute on Disability started, we also in 1986, I believe it was, had a conference, very small meeting of 25 to 30 people that was sponsored by the Mott Foundation on aging and disability. And it was, I think, 25 or 30 people. And it was 50% disabled individuals and 50% people from the aging community. And the purpose of that meeting was really to come together and look at what our vision was and where there were differences of opinion and what we needed to do to work more collaboratively. Now, from the IL side, we had people who were in their 20s up till their 60s or 70s who had disabilities. From the aging community, they were great people and leaders, but very few of them had disabilities. So I think one of the other important issues about the independent living movement, disability rights movement, is the fact that disabled people are the leaders of the movement. And I think frequently, I think programs like Ashby Village and others are so important because they are being led in most cases by older individuals. And obviously the goal is to keep people in the community But I think there still needs to be stronger relationships to really allow for people to feel comfortable in the skin of having a disability, of which there are many different types. I think both to learn from other people about what their experiences have been, learn about services, learn about getting mentors who've done things like hire personal assistants, deal with any one of a myriad of issues that may accompany some disabilities. But I think if we can come together in a more powerful way, in the end, it will really be an advantage for all of us.
That's an important point. There is tremendous overlap in the issues in the independent living and the independent aging movements, and really it's a continuation of the same thing in many ways. I appreciate
But
that.
it's still too frequently seen as separate.
Yep.
Obviously,
Yep.
you know, the aging movement represents a certain population, but the disability community cuts across that.
Okay, so, I'm sorry.
There's a question here about invisible disabilities. So if can I say something about that?
Well, I think that those questions are going to be gathered and collated later by Sigrid. So we'll go on with this part, and then those questions will.
Let me just say one thing.
Yeah.
One thing, when I talk about disability, I am not talking only about physical disabilities.
Right.
I think that's very important for people to know. So I'm talking about the full range of disabilities, onset of disabilities, blindness, low vision, deafness, hard of hearing, memory issues, intellectual disabilities, depression, anxiety, diabetes, whatever, of which there are so many. But if I could just be clear on that. And I know it's not a one size fits all. I completely understand that.
Okay, got it. So you mentioned WID, the World Institute on Disability. You founded that with Ed Roberts and Joan Leon.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that you organized the first conference on aging and disability. What else in your local experience shaped the way you then went on to address national and global issues when you moved on to top positions in the Federal Education Department, the State Department, the World Bank, and the Ford Foundation?
I'm sorry, ask me the question again.
Yeah, sure. What else in your local experience shaped the way you addressed national and global issues when you moved on to positions in the Federal Education Department, the State Department, the World Bank, and the Ford Foundation?
So one thing about both the Berkeley CIL and WID is CIL was the first Center for Independent Living in the US and the first CIL around the world. So what that meant was that we were a model that people began to look at. When I mentioned the fact that Martin provided funding for the center, that was critically important because it really allowed the organization to begin to become more structured and to really set it up as an organization to work with others, get more money, to be able to hire staff, etc. And the model that I was explaining earlier also about the Disabled Students Program and then the Berkeley CIL was very important because it was very much linked to the community defining the needs that it had. Also similar to what was going on with the over 60s health clinic. There was a program set up led by seniors, and it was creating a vision, a model for what people wanted to be able to live and be active in the community.
Right.
And so part of what we were learning was the importance of coalitions. And that was something very important to be sharing with other people as they were learning about CIL, for example. And I think the model of a local community-based organization. When Ed became the director of the Department of Rehabilitation, he was able to use some of the federal money to set up 10 centers for independent living in the state of California. So we had more centers in California by 1976 than the entire country. At that point, there were 3 or 4 others. The federal government didn't get involved until 78 when it put money in for 10 centers. So what did that mean? That meant that we were not only able to begin to evolve as CIL, but the other centers were evolving. We were cross disability, cross age, and like at the Berkeley Center, one thing that was very important, which was still novel at that point, was there were a group of people from New York who moved out to Berkeley and got involved with CIL. And we had our disabilities when we were younger.
Right.
What that meant was that we understood issues that were going on, for example, in the area of education. And it really allowed us to create a program that was not in any CIL at that point. And again, it was the voices of disabled individuals working with parents. And so what were we learning and what were we exporting? We were learning that we should not set our limits low, that we needed to really look at the wealth of knowledge that we had, not only in our community, but in communities around the country. And we were learning how to work with government. I mean, one thing that's, very clear in the Bay Area, certainly at that time, was that living in a smaller community also meant that you knew the mayor. You knew your city council members, or you could know them. You knew the county board. You knew your assembly people and your state senator, and also your congressional representative. And that was very empowering, because it also meant that as we were working in coalition with others, there were many great things that were happening, even around budgeting. The disability organizations, the health clinics, and others were forming informal coalitions that were enabling us to fight around budgets for the city council and from the county board. So we were not only through CIL and the other centers at that point, expanding what we were doing, but it also was an opportunity for us to work with many other organizations to talk about how it was their responsibility to be serving disabled people in housing, in healthcare, in shelters, on and on. And that didn't happen overnight, but slowly those types of changes have been made. And Berkeley, as a progressive community, we were able to get money from the city to set up a paralegal program, and which eventually became the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund. So there were some very critical changes that were going on that still to today make much of the work going on noteworthy. But I would say there's still not enough going on where the intergenerational movement of disabled people of all ages, older people, younger people, it's still not strong enough. We're still not coming forward in a more unified voice, which means that we need to be learning from each other and dialoguing with each other.
These are all such important points. That the flow between disability and aging and the implementation involves such common interests. And
let me make one point too,
yeah.
Peter.
Yeah.
I've always scratched my head about why, after the fires in the Oakland Berkeley Hills, when these beautiful homes that were destroyed were rebuilt, why they were not rebuilt to be accessible. I never understood that. And that, I think, is at the crux of some of the points that I'm making. If people looked at the fact that they may acquire a disability, which may be nothing more than becoming older and not being able to run up and down stairs as easily as you did when you were in your 20s, or preparing that you'd be able to stay in your home, at least on the first floor, having an accessible bathroom and bedroom. None of that happened. And we still see that housing policies are not reflective of where, I presume on some level, many people, in wanting to stay in the community, they have to be able to look at housing as a part of that.
Mhm.
And too many people are driven out of their homes into whatever type of living situation because they can't stay in place. And obviously that's one of the reasons why Ashby Village is important. But being more proactive so that new housing would have to be 100% accessible,
Mhm.
and new homes would have to comply with certain standards, which doesn't happen now.
Thanks. I'm going to shift gears a little bit. Disability is widely recognized as a civil rights issue, but why is it that so many educated and even progressive people can instantly identify the significance of, say, Selma or Stonewall or Delano, but they draw a blank if you mention the landmark 504 sit-ins that you helped organize here in 1977, and which then spread across, and which you helped to spread across the country. I'd like you to explain briefly the history and significance of 504, its relation to the ADA past 13 years later in 1990. And if you could, please speculate on why these nationwide 504 sit-ins, which went on for weeks, don't seem to resonate and were very productive in the end, don't seem to resonate outside of the disabled activist community.
So I think there are a number of reasons. One is media is still not covering disability as it needs to. Disability is still not being taught in our early childhood, primary, secondary, universities. It's not a natural, normal part of what we teach in social studies, in American history and world history. I think for those people who have seen CripCamp, and we have no numbers on that, at least 504 is something that may be ding, ding, ding. And the Americans with Disabilities Act, a little louder, ding, ding, ding. But in reality, even those people with disabilities who are affected by these laws don't know enough about them. And our movement is still a relatively young movement, although I think we've seen some very important growth spurts in the last 50 years or so. But I think another issue is that other movements still have not integrated disability issues into their movements enough. So I would say that's true in aging, where while there are people who are older and have disabilities, they are not necessarily disability advocates. And I think what's really important is that the voices of disabled people who are knowledgeable about laws and rights and activists need to be a part of all movements. And I think the other issue is, because disability is so varied, but also cuts across the entire BIPOC community, LGBTQI community, religious community, etc. If disability was something that was understood, if there was more reflective, more proactive work being done within these communities to really look at what are the biases within our organizations, what are we doing that is or is not inclusive of people with various forms of disabilities. So, for example, adult day healthcare. I know adult day healthcare is something that has filled an important need, but on the other hand, adult day healthcare is something that is segregating people. And if you look at the model for younger people, people with intellectual disabilities, developmental disabilities, on and on, there continues to be a real push for people being integrated into regular classrooms, into regular schools, for people who are working as teachers, administrators, etc., to understand effective ways of working with children, young adults, and adults who have disabilities. So there, I talked to a lot of different groups, and one of the ones here, the Easter Seals of DC, Maryland, and Virginia, was talking to me about how their adult day programs are having people come in who are less than 55 who have certain types of disabilities. Now, my question really is, what is going on with the senior centers? Are the senior centers bringing, welcoming, creating environments so that people with other forms of disabilities can be a part of those centers? Are the general people attending or participating in the senior centers welcoming of bringing certain types of disabled people into the senior centers? I'm sure I know the issues are the same as what goes on, in education.
So-
One of the grants that Martin, can you turn your camera on? One of the grants that Martin may not even remember, but San Francisco Foundation, raise your hand if you remember this. The San Francisco Foundation had money that was given to it specifically to work on the issue of senior centers and blindness. So we applied and we got the money, and we worked at the senior centers in Berkeley, where what we found was, I think there were 6 at that point. There were very, very low numbers of low vision and blind people who were participating in the senior centers. And what we did with that grant, I have no idea whether it's still in effect, but it was a very successful grant because we did evaluations of all the senior centers. Basic things like the colors that were on the walls, the games that they had, whether or not people who are blind or low vision could use them, whether or not people felt welcome, whether or not there were representation on the advisory committees that existed at that point within the centers, the senior centers. And we saw an appreciable number of people beginning to participate in the senior centers who previously had not. Now, what I think was really great about that grant is it was really hands-on, and it worked with the people who came to the senior centers as well as the staff. And it was really looking at what existed, what were the barriers, and what needed to be done to remove those barriers. So all of these stories, I think, are really meant to show that in a lot of cases, people don't know what to do, and the ability to really, thanks, Martin, the ability to know, signing off, what to do can be very helpful.
Okay, I'm going to jump in because we're running low on time. We want to get enough time for the audience questions, and I'm going to skip some of the things I'd love to talk to you about, because what you were just talking about is related to another question that I wanted to ask. It's a major question in all of the country's institutions right now, and in the CILs, is how to bring under the tent people who, for reasons of ethnicity, disability, lack of material resources, or sexual orientation, have historically been pushed to the margins of society. From your experience in battling for full participation of this by the disabled What lessons can you share on how major organizations today, including Ashby Village and disability rights organizations, can assure that the full, robust diversity of this country is reflected in its institutions?
I mean, I think in the independent living movement, certainly, and in other parts of the disability community, but certainly in IL, there's been a very big push on inclusivity, ensuring that there is appropriate representation from all of the different communities. And so it's not where it needs to be yet, because there's much more work that needs to be happening. But I think what we see today is quite different than what we were seeing in the 70s and 80s. Not just from the vantage points of underrepresented populations like the ones we've been discussing, but also in representation of disabled people. So people with psychosocial disabilities were a group that in the beginning were not being appropriately included, as well as people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Let me say that, you know, one reason why I think it's really important for the independent living movements, and in this case, the senior community working more hand in hand. And honestly, you'll hear from some disability rights leaders that it can be very difficult to work together because our models shouldn't be different, but in many cases, they're not linking as closely as they should be. And in the end, I think would be much more beneficial across the board if we were able to bring this intergenerational cross-disability population together, including all the other communities that, as I said earlier, should be engaging with disabled people that aren't necessarily doing that.
Right. I mean, the organizations want to. The question is how. You know, how
Have discussions, sit down and meet. And I think it's not something that's going to get handled overnight. But in California, I think working with CFILC, some of the other centers and senior groups to begin to look at where you all are, where you want to go, what some of the barriers are, and how to move forward. That's all doable. Christine Mills is someone I think is really good to talk with.
Thank you. So you write that you were conditioned at an early age. Well, let me just go back to your school system again. You were initially denied access as a fire hazard. And I think your early education experience is so important for everyone to understand because it shows what it meant to be disabled in America and to be different, in quotes, from most people your age. And in your memoir, you said, you say that it was as if you were speaking a different language. Describe briefly where the school system initially, how the school system made you feel and what it felt like. Let's get into your experience when you finally got to PS 219.
Well, let me say it's not just relating to education. It's relating to kind of any door that I'm going through. I was talking to a friend of mine the other day who's working for a large company, and a lot of what they're doing is on Zoom. She uses a wheelchair. She's also been to a few meetings where they've had to come together. She said to me, "It is amazing how people treat me when I'm on a Zoom call versus when they meet me." So I think that kind of summarizes it. These expectations that you have or biases that are seen by those of us who have disabilities, how we feel that, I don't want to say anything is 100%, but I define myself as a disabled Jewish woman, a Jewish disabled woman, a woman who's Jewish with a disability, flip them up in the air. And I speak about that because certainly in the Jewish community, and Berkeley, I think, was really, a really good place to be working on some of these issues of really being able to talk about how some of us were feeling about whether or not we were really being included in the Jewish community as we wanted to be, and what changes needed and still need to be made, because there's the physical access issues, captioning, sign language, audio description, physical accessibility, and working to make people with autism or whatever the disability may be to feel welcome and comfortable. But it's also very much reading, talking, learning, and learning from within yourself about where your biases are and how to address them. And they don't get dealt with easily. But I really do think that the fires in Berkeley, Oakland Hills are something very interesting to be analyzed. Why, when CIL at that point was quite well known, and people in those homes were not as young as they were when they first bought them, why, with their insurance money and their own money, did they go back to replicate homes that were so inaccessible? I think that really speaks to the fact that people are, I'm sorry, I can't see people. It's really, but I think it's relevant for people to, I mean, when I was speaking to a church group once, and the people I was talking with were mainly older, and they were talking about problems that they were facing. And that's when I was talking with them about, well, now that you're in the middle of the problem, what were you doing when you were younger? And what do we need to be doing when we're younger to be, and I'm not counting us out, I'm 75. So that's another thing. Now I'm in the middle of the aging community. And that's a whole other discussion. But I think we need to be much more proactive on looking at where our own biases are and how do we get to make the changes now and for the future that help us to create an environment where the views and attitudes towards disabled people are recognized in a way that says, Selma was terrible. These are the outcomes from it. What is 504 and what is the Americans with Disabilities Act? Why were those laws so very important? What did people have to do to get to them? And what are we doing across the board to implement the Civil Rights Act of 64, many other laws, 504, ADA? What are we as communities doing across the board to really address biases and discrimination and hold our elected representatives accountable?
Yeah, I remember there's a wonderful quotation. There's many wonderful quotations. I'm going to have to cut my question short, but from Being Human, your memoir, and I'd like to share a few of them with the audience. You say our inclusion was dependent on someone else being nice, something that you were conditioned to accept at an early age, and that out of that mindset, that shift in mindset is one that we need to kind of institutionalize around the country. The one that you have helped to spark throughout this country.
I mean, I think disabled people, many in the movement, are fighting for these changes.
Right. And you also say we were beginning to see our lack of access as a problem with society rather than our individual problem.
And that was very important.
Exactly. So these are all aspects that we confront now in associating in understanding not only disabled movement, but aging and everything else. We need to figure out ways, tools really, that organizations can perpetuate the advances that you've made. I'm going to have to, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Did you have an answer to that or?
No, we'll
No,
just
okay.
go to questions.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions. I think we should go to the questions now. I really appreciate this. Before I pass the gavel to Sigrid, who's a member of the Village's Arts and Culture Group, and will be fielding the audience questions, I'd like to end with a final quote from your memoir. People had been internalizing the idea that our barriers were our individual problem for so long, it was hard to shift. People had to get out of the habit of thinking, I can't get up the stairs because I can't walk, and get used to the idea and get used to thinking, I can't get up the steps because they are not acceptable. I'm sorry, because they are not accessible. So I just want to leave this part of the program with that quote, which I think is so wonderful. Thanks, Judy. And I'm going to kick it over to Sigrid for the questions that are coming from our audience.
Thank you. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you very much, Judith. And thank you, Peter. And so, yeah, let's go to the questions. We have quite a few. The first one, Judith, is the one that you already mentioned. Do you have any comments on invisible disability? That was a question from someone who has epilepsy.
So let me speak a little bit more about that. So I was speaking about the fact that when I talk about disability, I'm talking about visible and invisible disabilities. However, the speaker or the questioner stating that they have epilepsy, I think is very important because I don't know if I can see your face, if you can turn on your camera, but the question would be, how do you feel you're treated by others? Do they know you have epilepsy? Do you feel like you have to hide the fact that you have epilepsy? And in too many cases, what is happening, and this is not new and it's getting a little better, but people with invisible disabilities are afraid of speaking out about their disabilities. They're afraid of the stigma. They're afraid of, if they're working, implications at work, or just in their social life. So when I speak about how we need to have a better understanding of who we are, it really also means that those of us with visible and invisible disabilities have to feel that we can speak openly about what it is that we might need, what it is that we feel how we're being treated, that we may feel is discriminatory or limiting our ability to participate. But it's a very, very important question. And if we're truly educating ourselves, then we need to look for opportunities where people who have these various disabilities are able to speak up and out about how they're being impacted in their communities. Are they able to continue to play a proactive role or play whatever role it is they want to play? Or are they feeling that they're being excluded? Somebody asked a question here about, or made a statement about why there wasn't a sign language interpreter. So I think that's a great question. And there is captioning, as someone wrote, but I think having live sign language interpreters is a way of bringing in people from the deaf community who do use sign language interpreters. And it's a way of saying you're opening up to really have a broader discussion.
The next is more a comment than a question. I'm now the oldest member and leader of a small group in our San Francisco church, a group of older women. I find everyone has disabilities, although not all admit to this. I've worked with other aging people becoming disabilities and wanting to hide rather than be seen as disabled. Frustrating for me that has a slowly progressive muscular dystrophy. Judy, you helped me change my life to get out of my inaccessible house and into a reclining power chair. This of course changed my entire life. And yeah, so more.
I mean, I think it's, again, these comments are really important. And, you know, looking more deeply, the reason why I feel films, books, discussions are very important is really to allow these, I mean, they're not hidden, but allowing these views that really limit our ability to be more included. My presumption about, you know, why there is no sign language interpreter is possibly nobody ever asked for one. And then people may not know how to find them. So then that would be a great opportunity to be talking to one of the deaf groups like Takara, which is, I believe, in Oakland, DCARA, and other groups, to find out, are there older people who would like to participate in these kinds of lectures? Is there someone from the deaf community that could give one of these lectures? What are some of the demographics in your target area for deaf people, deaf older people? Because they definitely, I'm sure, are an underserved population.
Yeah, another comment here, multi-unit housing buildings have to be accessible. It's and aren't all groups containing disabled people?
Well, let's talk about that. Multi-units do not all have to be accessible. Multi-units have to have doorways wide enough and beams and things that are in place so if people want to put bars in. But I'm not exactly sure of the number, but you have to have more than a certain number of units in order, for example, to have an elevator. So, for example, the other day I was asked to speak to a group that's starting a program in Oakland, and it's working with a certain population of people. And there's multi-floors, but not, I know it's 2 or 3 floors, but they don't have an elevator. So it's the kind of building which is not just housing, but where there are going to be services provided in this building. But if you are unable to walk up steps, you will not be able to get to the 2nd floor. So I think these things are still going on because the laws are not strong enough.
There's a rather long message from Judy and from Connie, and she says, this is Connie, another disability rights advocate, 30 plus years, and you talk about the importance of independent living with access to the in-home supportive services program for your ability to gain access to personal assistance services and the ability to hire attendants to function. However, today's IHSS program and touted self-directed care model that makes the recipient solely responsible for finding their own care providers has led to disability discrimination when the state denies access to care and independent living for persons with severe impairments because the near minimum wages the state sets makes it impossible for such recipients to find care providers. There is an emphasis on family member care providers that allows the state to keep the care provider wages low. The state prioritizes family member providers, not independent living, and there are too few non-relative non-relative community care providers to work, denial of independent living, and institutionalization with aging.
Well, it goes with, I use a lot of personal assistance. And, you know, I live in Washington, D.C. now. The IHSS issue, or whatever the name of the programs are in other states, it's a major problem. Our immigration laws really need to be changed so that there's a larger pool of people out there to work, and the wages need to be appropriate wages, so that, you know, when people are having to travel to someone's home, and they're not being paid for their time, and they're not getting enough hours at an appropriate wage, these jobs are not that there aren't people out there who would be able to do the work, but the salaries and such are not sufficient. And, you know, there's, I think, stories here in the chat, but many others, where we know that people are not getting the services they're needing. They're needing to sleep in their wheelchairs. There's, you know, they're at all kinds of risk. And again, I think the stronger the movement of intergenerational disabled people and allies can become, where the stories are more graphically being told, the more we can fight to be able to make some more of these changes. And that's really what it's all about. I mean, it is inexcusable that people are having to live in fear of not being able to get appropriate services. And I think everybody on this, in this webinar, understand this, because although I don't know, just Ashby Village, it doesn't do anything around personal assistance, right? The volunteers don't help with personal assistance, right?
Well, I mean, personal assistance meaning like as a full-time job? No, they don't do that. I mean,
No, not as a full-time job, but if someone needs someone to empty a leg bag, would that be something that would be a service that?
I don't think so. I don't think so.
Exactly. So I think, I mean, it's a whole other discussion, but I think, Connie, you completely understand that. I mean, there is a large need out there, and I would say that it's a combination of needing more money, absolutely. It's also a combination of being able to make this work something which is seen as valued. And I don't have any difficulty with family members being paid if the person who needs the service really wants the family member to be the provider. And if they don't want the family member to be the provider, there should be alternatives. And I think this is definitely an issue that Ashby Village and others could be involved in discussing, relating to what needs to be done both at the county and state level to get more funding in these programs.
Yeah. Can you say something about how we can work more effectively to remove barriers facing hearing impaired people? You already kind of like talked about the sign language.
Well, I think, I mean, just a little more. At meetings, microphones need to be used, period. No one should say or should be allowed to get away with, I don't need a microphone, I have a loud voice. We need to have it where people who have a loss of hearing can in fact freely say that, and in advance. Tonight you have live captioning. Do you always have live captioning?
Yes, for the webinars and for our talks on Zoom, yes, we do.
You advertise that?
Yes, we tell our audience, yeah, that we have that. And also, I mean, the microphone, we do that, you know, when we have talks in person. And also, we also reserve the front rows. I mean, so for people that have a hearing disability. So, hi, Judy. Senior centers and other facilities seem to lack services in Spanish and other languages.
I mean, question would be why? I mean, are they hiring bilingual staff? Because obviously that's critical. And those really are issues, I think, that need to be addressed locally and hold on. But I think in a state like California, with the number of bilingual people, there should be a way of making sure that there's a premium being put on hiring people who are bilingual.
Okay. I have to ask you something, Judith. I mean, we have quite a few questions left, but there's also a lot of comments. Are you okay with me kind of like concentrating a little bit on the questions? Because otherwise I think we will run out of time. So,
Sure.
okay. Okay, so priority for access to, oh, that's another one. So to what extent are deaf people involved in the programs you speak about? And well, I'm surprised you don't have an interpreter today as you speak. So it's also, again, I mean, a little bit in.
Well, the interpreter issue, as I said, that's for the organization to provide. So I think it's something that the Ashby Village should look at when you're holding any more of these webinars. It should be a matter of course. Not all deaf people know sign language, but there are older people who know sign language and they like to be able to have interpreters. So it will open up the population of people that are brought in for sure.
So someone says California's emphasis that recipients lacking a circle of support will lead to the institutionalization of leaders within the disability community. What is your thought on this?
I mean, my thought is that everything we've been discussing tonight needs to be continually focused on, because people winding up in more restricted living environments because Berkeley has this program where, what is it called? It's an emergency service program. So if you have a disability and an attendant doesn't show up, you can call them to get an attendant for emergencies. I don't think Oakland and other surrounding cities have this. So it is a program that is worth looking into because it is intended to assist people in emergency situations to be able to get backup support. But the bottom line is comprehensively looking at is there data that you have now which is showing that people who are moving into restricted living arrangements would otherwise be living in the community. And those stories, I think, really need to be part of the crux of what is being done to get more funding for home and community-based services. Now, let me say something else. IHSS is a means-tested program, which means I presume many of the people on this webinar would not meet the means test. So we're also needing to look at, as we've been discussing, expanding IHSS so those people who meet the eligibility criteria are getting on, that we're looking at how to expand the pool of people who are providing personal assistance services, which means appropriate wages and benefits. But additionally, we're needing to look at, and maybe this is done with the state code, taxation code, there needs to be the ability to deduct more money for people that are paying for themselves, because it can be so expensive. There needs to be a way of looking at that issue. You know, obviously, if I had all the answers to these questions, there wouldn't be a need for the questions. So I think, you know, at the end of the day, what is important about programs like Ashby Village is, I know that you're more than just an organization that shares information. You're also a doer organization. So as such, I don't know whether things like home and community-based services is an issue that you've been working on. Is it, do you know?
No, but we have a very active elder action group at Ashby Village that really do a lot of active, you know, political action, you know, and in particular, something like that, I'm sure. And I know that some of the elder action members are part of the webinar today, and that is definitely something I'm sure that they could consider, you know, taking on.
I would say, does the older action group have people in it who are using wheelchairs, who use personal assistance as an example? Because not exclusively, but typically the people who come to a group, I'm not picking this group out on its own, but people who come to the group have issues that are typically issues that need to be addressed. But if it's a limited population of people that don't understand the issue of home and community-based services, it's not going to be addressed. So California has been a leader in this area, and there's likely to be other areas where it could be a leader. For example, allowing people to be, you know, to be able to work if they don't have a green card or working papers, something that could be done to bring in a larger pool of people to work. I think that would be worthwhile looking at.
Somebody asked, there are nearly 10 million persons are hard of hearing and close to 1 million are functionally deaf. I'm all for someone signing. I'm all for someone signing, but do you know what's being done to make closed captioning more accurate? I've written to several heads of tech companies.
There actually is work that's being done in this area. And it's been improving, but I agree with you, it's not where it needs to be yet. And ideally, if it could be accurate without a live captioner, we're certainly not there yet. But it sounds like either one or two people are asking a lot of questions, or there are more people involved who are deaf or hard of hearing. And so my question to whoever is asking this is getting back to the village and asking them questions and looking at what could be done. Because it's not just what Ashby Village is doing with their webinars, but it's also the issue of what are the organizations in the Bay Area that are working with older people, with seniors. What are they doing to ensure that seniors who are deaf or hard of hearing are getting appropriate support services, as well as blind and low vision? And the reason I mentioned this issue earlier about the program that San Francisco Foundation had supported was because it was definitely an unmet need. And I don't know what's going on with the senior centers today. I don't know how much of that has carried forward. But then also, you know, we're looking at people with mental health disabilities, with memory issues, with a whole array of disabilities. And many of these people are, as we all know, not being appropriately helped or served or appropriately engaged.
I'm a low vision support group facilitator. What would you recommend, and how would I start to advocate with Medicare to get vision services and devices covered? I don't know if this is something you can answer.
Well, I think at the local level, it's what are the services that people need? What are they getting? What are they not getting? On the Medicare issue, they're, working with the leading senior groups in California, AARP and others, I think would also be important. And it's a very relevant issue, but you need to be working within, and there is work that's being done. Groups like the California Foundation for the Blind, other organizations for blind and low vision people, they're definitely working on these. And maybe the Ashby Village could help you identify some of these groups.
As I suspected, someone from the Elder Action actually is on the webinar, and she said Ashby Village Elder Action Group currently works with CARA and hand in hand to support more and better services for people needing personal assistance, as well as legislation to enact long-term care for all. So just wanted
Probably would be good to be working with CFILC,
Mm-hmm.
California Foundation for Independent Living Centers.
Let's see, there's so many questions now. Thank you so much, Judy, for sensitizing us to better understand how we as an organization can contribute to making our arts and culture presentations more welcome and accessible to our community. And that would welcome the use of sign language. Seniors have a difficult time getting referrals from doctors for low vision services. And
that's because the doctors don't know what's out there. So that is a specific issue that I think could be worked on, looking at the medical schools in the Bay Area, and whether or not, whether or not they are training doctors and nurses in their training programs, and whether they're working with other providers to make sure they understand what is available, how to access it. This is not just an issue, it's an issue across the board where healthcare providers are not being appropriately trained. Hold on one second, what's the score? Okay, sorry. Sorry, San Francisco. Bye-bye.
Okay, this is a really interesting question. I deal with chronic pain as part of my disability and use a mobility scooter. I would like to go to protests, including those for other groups, but I'm worried about my safety. What would you recommend to keep myself safe at a protest?
Did you go to protests before?
I don't know. I mean, she didn't say that, but
I know. I've seen the question, but I would say a couple things. Did you go to protests before? And if you did, then, maybe go with somebody. Maybe you went by yourself before. Maybe you need to go with a friend now. But, there are all kinds of protests. Some types of protests, you may be concerned that they could become more volatile, and that would have been true before you used a scooter. But I go to protests, and people with scooters go to protests. Maybe it's also, again, if they're like protests where other seniors are going to be going, I think this is, if there's a contingent of seniors that are going to a protest, as an example, this should be an issue to be raised so that, as part of what the group is doing, it's maybe looking in advance on the site for the demonstration, the accessibility of the demonstration, and dealing with some of those issues. But I understand, your concern, but I would think as much as possible about what to do to be able to continue doing things that were important to you.
At this point, Judith, I normally ask, because you were already very generous with your time, how many more questions you are willing to answer, how much more time you give us, so.
Just a couple more minutes.
Couple more minutes, okay. Let's see. Yeah, there's one question about how effective are the Olmsted commissions in each state?
I'm sure that most people don't know anything about Olmsted. So Olmsted is a case that came from the Supreme Court in 1999. It was a Ginsburg decision, or written by the late Justice Ginsburg. It basically says that people with significant disabilities can live in the community. And like anything, it depends on the state that you live in. I don't know all of the Olmsted work that's going on, and I presume that the questioner here knows about the Olmsted work being done in California. But yeah, it's a state-by-state issue. And for those, it's an important project. It's an important report. So it might be something that Ashby Village wants to get a copy of and look at how it's done.
Okay, maybe this is a good question to finish. On a personal level, what work do you have ahead of you this year and next year?
So airline travel being safer for wheelchair users, but we don't have to be so concerned about our wheelchairs breaking, because that's one of my big concerns about flying, is the wheelchairs being broken and the amount of work that I have to do when I'm flying to try to help ensure that my chair doesn't get broken. And that means working with lots of organizations who are doing work in this area, but that is one area, hopefully, to get some of these barriers more effectively addressed. For me personally, my book is being turned into a movie. So the woman who is the writer-director is Sean Heder, and she's the person who did Coda. So I'm hoping this year, next year, the film will come out next year. That's what people are saying. So we'll see if that happens. And then I do a lot of public speaking to companies and organizations. And I also do a podcast called The Human Perspective, HEUMANN Perspective, which is on Spotify and all the other where you get your podcasts. And we do 2 a month, and we also do 2 YouTubes. So we're active on social media. So yes.
Well, that's great news about the movie that's coming out. I'm sure everybody will be
Getting written right now, so hopefully it's
hopefully coming out next year or this year.
yeah.
Okay, thank you so very much, Judith. I mean, thank you for
I'm sorry, one other thing, getting back to a point that Peter had raised earlier about how come people don't know about 504 and ADA. I really, watching the film CripCamp, I think is very important. Reading books like mine called Being Human. There's a young adult version called Rolling Warrior. Alice Wong, who lives in San Francisco, has a number of very good books out. One is an anthology, which is great because it's short stories by women with various forms of disabilities from many different communities. And so I think what's valuable about that book, outside of the fact that the people who've written are of note, is that it allows people to get a better understanding about a broader range of disabilities, certainly not exhaustive, but a broader range. I think, facilitating greater discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you again, Judith. And I give it back now to Rochelle.
And thank you very much, Sigrid, for helping field what were perhaps over 45 questions. So to many of you who weren't able to get your questions answered, we have them in the chat and we'll try to do our best. I'm Rochelle Lefkowitz, and I'm the co-founder and chair of the Ashby Village Arts and Culture Series that's now entering its 7th year. And to hear about a potentially life-saving program that we want to share with you, please stay on Zoom to the end of my brief remarks. As you might imagine, it takes a village to produce these inspiring events, and our special thanks today, of course, go to our distinguished guests, Judith Heumann, and to former Center for Independent Living board member, Ashby Village member, and today's interviewer, Peter Sussman, for this rich and deep dive into our two communities, as we all try to age with the dignity and the support that we all need to thrive. And I want to thank you, especially Judith, for your ideas for elder action to pursue. We have 111 members, and we do have groups on low vision and hearing, and all of us are eager to take some of your ideas, which I scribble down each time I heard them, to pursue. So we will hopefully emerge from today's memorable exchange with a better understanding of each other, those of us with more experience in challenges, and others of us who are newer to dealing with them. And I also want to say, for more about Judith Heumann, we would encourage you to read her amazing memoir, Being Human. And we'd encourage your book groups and your friends' book groups to read it too. The books are available at all 3 Pegasus independent bookstores, one in Oakland, 2 in Berkeley, one on Solano in Oakland, and the other on Shattuck Street. And the first 10 of you who go out and get these books will get them prepaid for by an anonymous donor to Ashby Village. Hopefully today will also help us become better able to build a strong enough bond together to resist the opponents of a potentially new California long-term services and support benefit for everyone in our state. So people who may try and divide us will try and keep us from having the support we all need as we all age. I also want to thank the members of our arts and culture group, our skillful question and answer manager, Sigrid Duisberg, and members Irene Marcos, Rondi Saslow, and our long-term outgoing member, Betty Webster. Thanks also to Ashby Village's Volunteer Services Coordinator, today's IT supporter, Jessica Sterling, our Executive Director, Bab Freiberg, Ashby Village's former development team coach, Martin Paley, and everyone who reached out to invite their friends and family, their neighbors and coworkers and others to join us here today. Our arts and culture events are free. If you were moved by today's inspiring and informative fireside chat, as I can't imagine most of you were not, we hope that you will consider making a donation to help us continue to bring you more of these remarkable events. And do encourage anyone who missed today's presentation to tune in to our YouTube channel starting tomorrow for the recording. Over 100 Ashby Village members and volunteers, as I've said, belong to our Elder Action Interest Group. We're always eager to leave you with something you can do about what you've just learned. And certainly Judith has given us plenty of food for thought on that level. But here's another gem today. As people with disabilities and older adults who rely on energy for our life-saving medical equipment and to meet our access needs know that power outages like the ones many of us experienced earlier this month are not simply an inconvenience, but they can cause devastating consequences to our health and to our safety. Currently, the Center for Independent Living, CIL, has a portable battery program that offers and delivers free emergency portable batteries to people who use medical equipment or assistive technology, or whose caregivers use those. All of those folks who rely on electricity are eligible for the portable battery program. So for more about CIL's portable battery program, or their other emergency preparedness and resiliency services, we'd like you to please contact Emma Martin online at emartin@centerforindependent-living.org. And that's going to be in our recording for you all to check into, or call Emma at 510-422-5085 to check and see both if you qualify and for the availability of these portable batteries. So again, thanks you all for coming this afternoon.